Hello everybody, welcome to our first lecture in social and political philosophy. So today we're going to just introduce what this topic is, what the subject matter is, although it's fairly straightforward. And then we're going to take a look at Robert Nozick. Now we've got a debate between Nozick and Rawls that we're going to look at first, which is really this question of how should we deal with the tension between freedom and equality. And then in our next pair of readings between Mill and Young, we're going to take a look at really the question of individual rights and freedoms. What sorts of limits should be put on individuals and just what they're allowed to do in society. So social and political philosophy is a fairly straightforward branch of philosophy. It's not like metaphysics or epistemology where even those words themselves you may have never heard of before our course. Social and political philosophy is philosophy about social and political matters. Now, it's a normative area of study, like ethics. It's really about how things should be done, not just a question about how things are done. So social and political philosophy, of course, is interested in how societies and political organizations really are put together, but it's not merely a descriptive enterprise. So political science and sociology are more interested in getting the descriptions right, really, counting what's going on, where, who's doing what, how do these systems function, and so on. And this isn't to say those aren't interesting and important questions. Those just typically aren't the sorts of questions philosophers are interested in. Where you will see some overlap is in areas of sociological and political science theory. You'll see overlap with social and political philosophy there. In fact, political scientists who are doing political theory and social and political philosophers, in some sense, they're very much just doing the same thing. So there's some very serious overlap between the disciplines in those areas. So we've got some sample questions here. What sorts of things are social and political philosophy interested in? Well, how should societies be organized, broadly speaking, right? What's the best kind of society to be in? Now, justice, when we're talking about a just society, law, or institution, of course, these are interesting and important questions for social and political philosophy. Now, a good way to think about justice is that it's the characteristic feature of a good social or political institution. So if we think about individual actions as, say, right or wrong, perhaps good or bad, if a society, a law, or institution is just, then it's really right, in a sense. That's the best way for it to be. That's how it should be. So in some sense, that institution should be just is just a trivially true claim, because really to say that an institution should be just is to say that it should be organized in the way it should be organized. That's the best sort of way. So the real question is, what does that mean? What is the best way to do that? Now, the two questions really we're going to look at in our readings are really these next two. What level, if any, of equality does justice demand? This is really the tension we're going to see between Nozick and Rawls. Nozick's going to argue really none or the absolute bare minimum. Rawls is going to argue a lot more than you might expect. Lastly, what limits, if any, should be placed on individual freedom? We're going to see John Stuart Mill defend the view that there should be, in some sense, very, very small limits on individual freedom. We should give individuals, in some sense, the widest possible freedom of choice. So we should legally limit them as little as possible. We're going to see Young come in and say, well, that might sound like a good idea, but unfortunately that can give rise to certain sorts of problems. So sometimes actually interfering in the free choice of individuals produces a better society overall, and so really should be done. Now, Nozick himself, American philosopher of the 20th century, attended and taught at some pretty big name institutions, wrote several books. Now, the reading we have here is out of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, written in 1974. This is an important and interesting book. Nozick himself, I think, is a very good writer, so hopefully the reading is enjoyable. I'll be honest, I think Nozick is a better writer than Rawls. I think both Young and Mill are also nice writers, so we're going out, I think, on a strong note in terms of good writing in the course. Rawls is, unfortunately, a little bit clunky. Now, that said, he's also quite clear, which is nice. So this book of Nozick's, in some ways we're doing things backwards here. This book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, is actually a response to Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, which came out in 1971. Now, I've got them flipped around here, and I've got my own reasons for that. In some ways, I think Nozick's view is a sort of simpler and more straightforward view. It's a good one to start with. And then it helps us transition into Rawls's view, because what Rawls is really arguing for, in some sense, is a way of trying to respond to a position like Nozick's, which seems to make a certain intuitive amount of sense, certainly. And now I'm not saying Nozick's view is wrong. I just think it's, in some sense, a little bit easier to understand what Rawls is trying to do if we start with Nozick and then move into Rawls. Okay, so with that sort of prefatory material out of the way, let's just go ahead and take a look at what Nozick has to tell us. So he is giving us what he calls the entitlement theory. Now, the entitlement theory is a version of libertarianism. This is probably a word you've heard before. Now, libertarianism is a certain political philosophy, and I'll use the term sometimes political philosophy, social and political philosophy. These things really come as a package. When we're talking about politics, of course, any sort of politics is embedded within a society and affects that society. So these things are really interactive. If I ever talk about just social philosophy or political philosophy, I really mean both together. Now, libertarianism is, depending on how detailed you want to get, either one kind of political philosophy, social political philosophy, or a family of them. Now, certainly this entitlement theory is some version of libertarianism. In fact, Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, is taken as a fairly influential book in libertarian circles, or at least some. Now, really, libertarianism advocates for maximal liberty of individual citizens. That is, individual citizens should be as free as possible to do what they want, right? Make the choices that seem like good choices to them. We're going to see that, in fact, Mill's view, which we're going to see in next week, could very well be called a version of libertarianism as well. And so we've got these sort of big terms, libertarianism compared to, say, liberalism, and I'll explain the difference here in a moment. Now, of course, whenever you have this big sort of abstract term, really what you can do is try to sketch exactly what that means, and then there's always these questions of, when we get down to the particulars, you know, particular thinkers, or particular books, or particular ideas, or principles, or judgments, or whatever they might be, what overall group do they best fit into? You know, say, is John Stuart Mill best understood as a libertarian or as a liberal? It's an interesting question. I largely want to shelve that for now and just focus on this sort of big difference between libertarianism, which really holds this view that individual citizens should be as free as possible to do what they think is right. Contrast that with liberalism. Now, as soon as you hear liberalism, you might think, say, Liberal Party of Canada or Liberal Party of Australia or something like that. We need to distinguish between particular parties that call themselves, a liberal party or have liberal in the name like that, from the overall school of thought or movement of liberalism. Now, both liberalism and libertarianism, as you can see, have the stem liber, L-I-B-E-R. Of course, the University of Lethbridge prides itself on offering a liberal education. What does that mean, really? Well, it's not supposed to brainwash you into voting liberal or something like that. Rather, liber and liberal really comes from Latin. The word liber itself really just means free. So liberal is really just sort of an adjectival form of free, right? So to be liberal is, in some sense, to be free. You can think about a liberal party as, in some sense, a freedom party. Now, of course, they don't call themselves that. You might have a separate party that calls itself a freedom party. So there must be some kind of differences here, right? Especially if we're looking between libertarianism and liberalism. If they're both interested in freedom, what's the difference between them? Well, this is where some history comes in. And so when I'm talking about John Stuart Mill, he's often regarded as a liberal rather than a libertarian, even though arguably his views are more libertarian than liberal. Well, what's with the difference? Well, in the 19th century, liberalism was very much about freedom of the individual, freedom of choice, getting government out of interfering with what individuals wanted to do and how they wanted to advance their lives and live the way they saw fit and so on. So liberals in the 19th century very much advocated for governments to, in some sense, get their hands off the actions, beliefs, and property of individuals. So 19th century liberals advocated for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to live your life as you saw fit. Right? Now, this continues. So in the 20th and 21st centuries, liberals are still advocating for the same sorts of things. But part of what happened is that there's a little bit of a shift going into particularly the 20th century, and it's carried over at least to some degree to the 21st century, though we won't get too bogged down in all the details. This is a good place to go to, say, political science for. What went on is that within liberalism, there became a growing recognition that if people don't have certain goods, right, well, let's just call it money, but a certain level of resources, right? If you don't have enough resources, then you can't really exercise your freedom of choice. So look, the government could say, okay, legally you can do whatever you want, right? And so you're free to make the choices you want and to get the rewards from your choices or to suffer the consequences of bad choices, right? It's up to you. You have to take responsibility for what you do. Now, of course, if you don't actually have resources, you don't have, say, money, you don't have property, in some sense, you don't really have choices. So look, if you have no resources at all, you're going to starve to death, right? You need food. We all need food. We all need shelter. We all need access to medical care of some sort. Liberalism in the 20th century really came to recognize this fact. And if somebody doesn't have food, they don't really have a choice. Now, strictly speaking, they have a choice between, say, working at a particular sort of occupation or something, or starving to death. But that's not really a great choice. And so the invention of the welfare state got linked up with liberalism. And theoretically, this was made palatable by really construing a redistribution of wealth, at least to some degree, as really just providing all people with the basic resources they need to actually be able to exercise their freedom of choice in a way that really granted them meaningful choices to make. We're going to see Rawls defend a version of liberalism in our next video. Now, this is where libertarianism, or to some extent what we might call neoliberalism, evolved as a kind of reaction to that in the later 20th century. So libertarians generally, as well as neoliberals, we can distinguish those two. I'm just going to run them together for the sake of what we're doing here. Some people might think that's a terrible mistake. I'm open to criticism if you think that's a bad idea. But anyways, I'm just going to treat those as basically synonymous. So libertarianism or neoliberalism tries to, in some sense, harken back to that original form of liberalism that really emphasized the freedom of choice of the individual and wanted governments to stay out of the sphere of individual choice as much as possible. Because of course, if you want to redistribute resources and make sure that everybody has at least some certain level of resources, whatever level that is, right? Whatever we think the bare minimum should be for people. Well, resources don't just come from nowhere. We don't just make them up. There's no creation ex nihilo, right? Creation for nothing, the way Craig was thinking about when we were looking at the cosmological argument. So if you want to make sure all the people in the society have a certain level of resources, just say, I don't know, $10,000 a year or something. Well, it's got to come from somewhere. Where's it going to come from? Presumably other people. What's that going to mean in practice? Well, some kind of redistributive system, namely taxes, right? It might be sales taxes, income taxes, taxes on business, whatever it might be, it's taking from some people and giving to others. Now, depending on how we want to think about that, we could view that as a form of theft. This is really what Nozick is going to be arguing for. Or we can actually view that as a demand of justice. That to live within a society is to see ourselves as members of one team, so to speak, and that within the team we share resources to make sure nobody goes without, that nobody is too badly off. The people who are better off can share with the people who are worse off, and no matter where you are, if you're in a worse off position, then you become better off. Well, now you're in a position to give back to those who were worse off to start with. But in libertarianism, this is a good short way to sum it up. Libertarianism, society is made up of different individuals, and it's wrong to force some individuals to give property to other individuals. That's really just a form of theft or even perhaps slavery. In the other view, society is really a kind of community. It's a kind of large group, and your entitlement to hold property itself is really a function of the group and what the group is willing to tolerate. So making some people give at least some degree of their property to others to make sure those other people aren't really terribly off itself is a demand of justice. It's not a form of injustice. In fact, justice demands that we have this kind of redistribution. Okay, so there's the big overview in terms of the debate between Nozick and Rawls. Now let's take a look at some of the details of Nozick's theory. So this entitlement theory that Nozick offers us has three main principles. First, the principle of justice in acquisitions. Now this principle concerns how unowned objects are initially acquired, how they become owned, right? This is the whole acquisition. So Nozick doesn't talk too much about this, but presumably at some point, you know, if you go back sort of far back enough in human history, not everything was owned. There was a world of stuff around us. There was some kind of world, and people started to own things. They would acquire things. They'd make them their own somehow. How would they do that? Well, one way to think about it, and this is for roughly how Nozick thinks about it, but we're not going to focus on it too much, is that the way you come to own something is by mixing your labor with it. So say there's a bunch of fruit trees, right? Say we're in what philosophers often call the state of nature, where there's no government, there's no political organization, we're just sort of out living off the land or something like that. Say we come across a bunch of fruit trees. Now, none of us own the fruit trees, they're just there. Say I go and pick a bunch of fruit off the tree. Well, at least on one view, that fruit is now mine. Why? Because the fruit up on a tree is just anybody's. But the fruit I go and pick and select and say, put in my basket, that fruit becomes mine because it's only in that basket because of the labor I put into it. Now, over time, that sort of way of acquiring goods, even property, right? You come to own land by working it or doing something with it. Over time, that's seeing that as a way that unowned things become owned. You can then build up to a situation where most, if not all, things are owned, as they sort of largely are in the modern world. Second, so it's the second and third principles we're going to look at most, and really the second one's the most important. So the second principle is the principle of justice in transfer. This principle concerns how owned objects, how things that people have already come to own somehow, our possessions, our property, right? The principle concerns how those things are transferred between owners, right? How is a transfer just? If I own something and you own something, how is it that the thing I own becomes a thing you own? We're going to hear a little bit more about that, but the short answer is because I voluntarily give it to you. The third principle is the principle of rectification of injustice. Now, if there's an unjust transfer of possessions, namely theft, right? If somebody takes something that isn't theirs, this principle addresses what should be done in that kind of situation. There's going to have to be some kind of compensation, so you might owe somebody something, you might be arrested and punished in a certain kind of way. But so here again, we're not really focused on this principle, but Nozick thinks in terms of a theory of justice focused on property and goods, right? The sorts of things we own. His version of that theory is the entitlement theory, and that theory just has these three principles, right? These three principles are going to give you a full theory in terms of who gets entitled to what. So we've got the first principle about how unowned things become owned. The second principle concerns situations where we all own things and how do we trade them and exchange them, right? How do we move ownership around? The third principle is really just what happens when the trade in ownership, when things get exchanged somehow, what happens when that's not done correctly, when that's done unjustly, right? Or wrongly would be a way to put it. Okay, so these are the three principles of the entitlement theory. Now, Nozick tells us, he says, the complete principle of distributive justice. Now, what is that? Well, the complete principle of distributive justice is, let's just look at distributive justice. What's that? It's really this area of political philosophy concerned with how goods are distributed in society, right? Distributive justice is really this question of how should goods be distributed? What's the right way to do it? So on Nozick's view, the complete principle of distributive justice, all we really need to know to be able to answer that question, how should goods be distributed in society? Well, this complete principle of distributive justice would say simply that a distribution is just if everyone is entitled to the holdings they possess under the distribution. A distribution is just if it arises from another just distribution by legitimate means. The legitimate means of moving from one distribution to another are specified by the principle of justice in transfer. That's second principle. The legitimate first moves are specified by the principle of justice in acquisition. Whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. So just with those three principles, really even just the first two that we were just taking a look at, Nozick says you can get the complete principle of distributive justice out of it. Who's entitled to what? Well, that's really a question of what distribution is just, right? To answer that question, Nozick says all you need to know is, and this is a big ask, right? But in principle, all you need to know is how people came to justly acquire goods in the first place. So you need to be able to say for anything and everything, how is it that people came to own this? Secondly, what trades happened? What voluntary exchanges occurred between people? As long, it doesn't matter what the distribution is. So it doesn't matter in your society how equal or unequal the distribution of goods are. Whether or not the distribution is just only depends on how we got there. So how did people come to have goods in the first place? Assuming they all justly acquired their goods in the first instance, then they're entitled to what they have initially. Then, if people only exchange goods, if goods only change hands in accordance with that second principle, namely that people freely trade them with each other, then it doesn't matter at the end of the day or really at any point in time how the goods are distributed. It doesn't matter how equally or unequally they're distributed. All that matters is that people are entitled to what they have. That's all that makes a distribution just, and people are entitled to what they have as long as the initial acquisition and then transfer of those goods are done in accordance with the basic principles of the entitlement theory. Now, Nozick distinguishes between two kinds of principles: historical principles and end state or end result principles. Now, end state principles are not historical. They concern patterns. And we're going to see that this is really Rawls's view. Right? So end state principles concern the pattern of distributions and so aren't concerned about who actually occupies places in the pattern. What does this mean? Well, like I was mentioning when I was talking about Rawls, let's say you're an end state principle theorist, and when you're thinking about political organization and the distribution of goods and the distribution of wealth in society, you often hear this kind of talk where people talk about, oh, how much do the 1% own, or something like that. What are the bottom 10% own? And those are interesting facts, right? They're certainly relevant in some sense. Now, if you're an end state theorist, you have some kind of view about what is a just distribution of goods, right? If you say, oh, the 1% owns 30% of the wealth in Canada, I'm not sure that's correct. I'm going to put a link down in the comments to another video that I think is very interesting to watch on this score. And it gives some numbers to that sort of effect, but I'm just making this up off the top of my head. Let's just say the wealthiest 1% of Canadians owns 30% of the wealth in Canada. Now, presumably if we point that out, we might think that's a problem, right? Particularly depending if we say, do you know how much the wealthiest 1% own? They own 30% of all the stuff in Canada. I might say, okay, so what? Well, they own too much. Okay, if it's too much, how much is the right amount? How much should the top 1% own? One view, the wealthiest 1% should only own 1% of the goods. So in fact, nobody's the wealthiest. Maybe the distribution's perfectly equal, right? Everybody gets exactly the same. If it's not that, then what is it that the wealthiest people should get? Should the top 1% own 2% of the goods, 5%, 10, 15, 20, 29? Right? If you're making a claim that some segment of society owns too much, then it seems like you need to be able to answer the question, well, then how much should they have? Because if you can't answer that question, then you can't really say with a straight face they have too much, because you don't know how much they're supposed to have. Because if they have exactly how much they're supposed to have, then they don't have too much. Or in fact, if they don't have enough, they don't have too much. So we need some sense of how wealth should be distributed to be able to make claims such as the 1% owns too much of the wealth. Right? To have a view like that is to be an end state principle theorist. That's to say, oh, there's a certain pattern that we want in terms of wealth, right? Maybe it's some kind of bell curve or something. Okay, that's not really going to work the way I want it to. But it's this real question. How much stuff should different segments of the population have? If that's the way you want to think about the just distribution of goods in society, you're an end state theorist on Nozick's view. Now, he himself favors historical principles. Historical principles that concern the distribution of goods are concerned with what's actually happened and not with patterns. So the one feature about end state principles is that they care about the pattern but not who occupies places in the patterns. So just go back to this 1% thinking. How much should the 1% own? Let's say our answer is 10% of the goods in the society. Right? Now, what that sort of pattern isn't interested in is who is a member of the 1%. All it's really interested in is that the people in the wealthiest 1% should own 10% of the goods in society. Now, I'm not in the 1%. Presumably, you're not either. Now, if you're an end state principle theorist, it doesn't really matter if we become people in the 1%. All that matters is that the 1% still owns the same share of goods. So Nozick criticizes that view by saying that it doesn't really care about the history. It doesn't care about how people came to have their wealth or goods. Right? On one view, we could just trade people out, right? We could just take you and trade everything you own with somebody in the 1%. All that's happened is a change in who particularly owns what, but we haven't seen a change in the pattern. Nozick thinks there's a weird problem there, right? If you've come to own your property by making good decisions and so on, right, through some actual history, right? People have actually given you things, you've worked for things, you gain entitlements over your property based on what's actually happened. History matters, right? There would be an injustice in suddenly trading places between you and somebody in the 1%. All your property rights change, right? Or take you and somebody who has less stuff than you. If we just swapped all your property, Nozick would say, well, there's a problem there. There's a kind of injustice because what's yours is yours because of what's actually happened, right? What you've actually bought, what people have given you and so on. It's not because society or the state has decided you get this particular cluster of goods. Now, for a historical principle theorist, Nozick thinks we can't be a patterned or an end state principle theorist. We can't be concerned with patterns because history itself isn't necessarily going to produce some particular kind of pattern. Right? And this is really Nozick's major point. There's no overall pattern to the just distribution of holdings. That whole way of talking about, oh, well, how much does the 1% own? How much does the bottom 1% or the bottom 10% own? What's the middle, what's the sort of median amount of goods that are held? Says that's irrelevant to questions of justice. Whether or not the distribution of goods in a society, the distribution of wealth is just, it's just a separate question from what kind of pattern those goods have. Right? Now, as I was already mentioning, Nozick thinks to say that there's no pattern to the just distribution of holdings or wealth or property or goods, these all basically interchangeable terms here. To say that there's no pattern to it is just to say that there is no model that we should be striving to attain, right? The just society is one where the top 1%, the wealthiest 1% own a total of 5% of the wealth, right? Nozick is saying that's precisely the wrong way to think about it. But the actual distribution of holdings isn't totally random, right? It's not that we just sort of spin a wheel and then you get whatever chance happens to give to you. Instead, the change in the distribution of goods, right? The reason that someone gets more wealth, somebody else loses some, and so on, can be explained through what people own, right? Their holdings, and their reasons for transferring. Now, we can't in advance predict all the reasons why people might exchange goods the ways they do in accordance with the second principle of the entitlement theory, right? So people are free to basically do whatever they want with their goods as long as it's their choice, right? It's up to an individual to choose what they want to do with their wealth. It's unjust to force them to do something with it. This is the basic idea. Now, we can't always tell ahead of time what people are going to do and why they're going to do it. Take, for instance, just Bill and Melinda Gates. Super billionaires, right? Tons of money. They collected money for a very long time, and now what are they doing? Giving away all sorts of it. In fact, there are several billionaires who are doing this. Now, that's not to overstate the case and say, oh, all the billionaires are doing it. No, because there's a whole bunch that aren't. And that's precisely where the unpredictability comes in, right? When some people get a lot of wealth, they'll give a lot away. When other people get a lot, they'll just keep collecting it, right? Some people just don't really save money when they get it. Other people do. Whether or not you choose to save money that comes your way and try to live austerely, or you spend whatever you get and you don't have any savings, those are individual choices. And Nozick thinks we shouldn't interfere with people's decisions to try to force them to make one decision rather than another, or make them fit a particular kind of pattern. He thinks there's an unjust interference in the individual's choice there. So there's no overall pattern we should be pursuing, but that's not to say that the distribution of wealth is completely random. We can explain it by people's choices and the results of those choices. So to be a patterned theorist, or to be an end state principle theorist, Nozick thinks we have to separate production and distribution, right? Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, that means to separate what gets made from who deserves it. And Nozick thinks that we can't arbitrarily separate these. So look, if I, for instance, just this video right now, I'm making this video, right? It's my product. I'm creating it. Now, because I'm creating it, it's my creative product. I own this. I own the rights to this. Now, let's say, I'm going to flatter myself. Let's say, for some reason, these philosophy videos of mine become wildly popular. Millions of people flock to my YouTube channel wanting to watch my videos. And let's say that they're so popular, I can start charging money for it, right? 5 cents a view or something. Now, say I put some kind of price on it. To watch my philosophy videos, you've got to give me 5 cents a view. Now, am I entitled to all the money I make from them? Right? The videos are my product. Nobody helped me make them or anything. Do you or anybody else deserve part of the profits from what I'm doing? This is precisely the issue at stake here, right? Who made something versus who benefits from its creation. To be an end state theorist, to think that the just distribution of wealth in a society has to fit some kind of pattern, is precisely to separate production from distribution. Right? So when people come up with some kind of invention, it's wildly popular, right? It helps all sorts of people. All sorts of people voluntarily want to exchange their goods, their property, for this new thing, right? Say it's a smartphone, or a laptop, or a vehicle, or clothes, or music, or videos, or right, anything people buy, right? When people buy something voluntarily, what are they doing? They're taking their own property, right, which we abstractly represent as money, right? Money is just sort of stands in for everything else, makes it more convenient than carting around things you want to trade and finding people to trade them. Right? So we've got money as this kind of abstract representation of purchasing power, right? You exchange it for goods and services. So when you've got something to give, you get money for it. When you want something from other people, you give them money. So anytime there's a voluntary purchase, right? Somebody goes to a store or whatever it is, pays money to get some kind of good or service. What they're really doing is making a choice, right? They're choosing to get that good or service in exchange for that much of their purchasing power. Nozick thinks you can't separate out what people produce from what they deserve. If they're producing something all sorts of other people want to give them all kinds of money for, right? Well, then they deserve it. Right? Other people who aren't producing it don't deserve the money they're making. They can get their own money by having people voluntarily give it to them in exchange for some kind of good or service that other people actually want. So Nozick sums this all up in this sort of slogan. This is a kind of provisional slogan: from each as they choose to each as they are chosen. That's a kind of version of Karl Marx's famous slogan. So Marx, of course, great sort of writer, grandfather of communism, I guess would be a way to put it. You need to think about that as a kind of political theory rather than, you know, in practice when you look at particular states, you look at the Soviet Union or something, or you look at a democracy and say, well, this is liberal and that's communist. Well, sort of, right? The theory is always in some sense divorced from the practice because, you know, we can theorize about how things would work in the best case scenario, which is what Nozick is doing here. He's giving a kind of idealized scenario. Of course, in the real world, it's this patchwork system where we've got various competing ideas and people trying to realize those ideas, and we've got all sorts of real practical issues that in some sense get in the way of realizing these theories. But anyways, Marx's slogan is from his slogan was, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. What does that mean in practice? Well, what comes from you, right, is whatever you're able to make. So whatever you're able to produce is what is in some sense given away. How much do you deserve? How do things get distributed? Well, according to your needs. So if you produce all sorts of stuff, right, you are giving all kinds of things to the community. But if you don't need very much, then you get not very much, right? The fact that you make all sorts of stuff doesn't mean that you're entitled to all sorts of stuff. Now, say you need all sorts of things, but you yourself don't make very much. Well, then on the communist system, you don't have much output. You don't sort of give much to the community, but you take an awful lot from it. Nozick flips that around with his own provisional statement of the entitlement theory. From each as they choose to each as they are chosen. How much do you give to the community? How much do you give to others? Whatever you choose, right? However much you want. If you want to give away everything you have, wonderful. If you want to give away nothing, okay, that's your choice. If you want to give away anything in between there, anything between everything and nothing, well, it's up to you to choose how much, right? And different people will choose different amounts for different reasons. But that's their right. How much do you deserve, right? Well, in some sense, you don't deserve anything. But what you do deserve is what people give you because they choose to give it to you. Now, they can choose to give it to you for all sorts of reasons, right? They could just give it to you out of charity, right? They just want you to have it. They give it to you because you do something good for them, right? You exchange goods or services somehow. Maybe they just like you, right? Maybe they're part of your family. Maybe they're a friend or something. There are all kinds of reasons people give other people goods and services, right? Exchange property. And Nozick says, that's the whole idea. It's not up to a government or a society to tell individuals what they should and can do with their own property. One note, and I hope I don't see this on the exam, a lot of people like this phrase or something like it. People work hard for their money, so they deserve it. That's not really Nozick's view. Why isn't it his view? Well, in one sense, in one narrow understanding, this is what Nozick is saying. Look, when people work and then they get paid for it, right? And presumably if they work hard, they get paid well. Okay, that's all well and good. What's really going on there? One or more people are willing to pay one or more other people money for working hard, right? And people deserve money when they work hard. Well, maybe, but in Nozick's view, people only deserve what other people are willing to give them. So working hard in and of itself isn't what entitles you to money, right? And in fact, look, you can have different people that work equally hard, but produce different amounts of things, or work equally hard, but they're producing different sorts of things that other people have greater or lesser demand for. So it's not how hard somebody works that determines whether or not they deserve their money, right? What about the slogan, people work fairly lazily for their money, so they deserve it? Not quite such a good slogan, right? How much do people deserve based on their hard work? Whatever other people are willing to give them. Do you deserve your money even if you don't work hard? Nozick says, yes, if and only if other people choose to give you money, right? Maybe they don't care if you work hard, right? Maybe your job is once an hour to press a button, and maybe somebody's willing to pay you $100,000 a year to do that, right? That's not working hard. Once an hour, a little timer goes off, you press the button, right? You do that, what, 8 hours a day, and you just or sit around and watch TV? That's not hard work. But if somebody's willing to pay you $100,000 a year, and you agree to that, right? So it's a voluntary exchange. Nozick would say, well, then you deserve your money. It's not because you work hard. It's because somebody is willing to pay you that agreed upon amount for doing what you agreed to do for the money. Right? So his view is not that people deserve their money because they work hard for it, right? They may come to deserve money because they work hard, and other people are willing to reward them. But it's not just about how hard somebody works. That's not what entitles them to what they have. I'm just going to back up. I advanced the slide, but I'm going to back up a second. Ultimately, Nozick thinks if you try to take up a view like people work hard for the money so they deserve it, this is just another kind of pattern. Because now, all of a sudden, that sounds like something like what people deserve to, how much money people deserve depends on how hard they work, right? Nozick says, no, that's just another kind of pattern. There should be no underlying pattern to who deserves what, right? It's not about how hard you work. It's not about even like how much you produce. It's not about what you do for work, how long you work, how hard you work while you're working, right? None of those things matter. It's not about your IQ or how tall you are or anything. All that matters is that people voluntarily give you wealth, right? All exchanges of property ought to be done voluntarily. And that's the only way that they come to be justly exchanged between people. Now, a system of taxation, right, that redistributes goods from one person or group to another person or group is a kind of coerced redistribution. This separates production and distribution. So look, we'll just stick with me as an example. I work for the University of Lethbridge. They pay me a salary. Right? It's mutually agreed on. They said, okay, we'll pay you this much if you do these sorts of things. I said, yep, that sounds good. So through voluntary arrangement, they pay me a certain amount of money to do what I do. Now, how much of that do I get to keep? Well, honestly, I'd have to go do the math, but there are these things called taxes, right? Taxes come off my paycheck. They're income taxes. I'm sure you've experienced this as well, and you will going into the future. When you go to purchase goods and services, there's also taxes. So in Alberta, we've got just the GST, right? That's really the federal tax. There's no provincial sales tax. And virtually all the other provinces, you do have some kind of provincial sales tax as well. So you get taxed when you make your money, you get taxed when you spend your money. And then there's the income tax system, which is, of course, is part of what's coming off the paycheck, which then, depending on how much money you made over the year and how much you had to spend on different things, and there's this sort of very arcane and complex calculation that gets done, right? You file your taxes, and then the government tells you how much more money you owe them, or how much they're going to give you back, or whatever that is, right? Now, I can't write into the Canadian Revenue Agency, yes, I'd prefer not to pay my taxes, so please just give it all back. Thanks, bye. Right? Like, you don't get to choose to pay your taxes. You have to, right? It's a legal responsibility. If you don't do it, you're subject to all sorts of legal sanctions, fines, potentially imprisonment, losing property and so on, losing some of your freedom, right? It's serious stuff. So what's going on there? Well, in Nozick's view, if you don't choose to give your property away to help other people, whether it's the government coming in through the form of taxes and saying you're going to be punished if you don't pay them, or say the mafia coming in and saying, you owe us protection money, and that you're going to get punished if you don't pay us, right? Or somebody just sneaking into your home or something and taking the amount that your taxes would be. For Nozick, that's all basically the same thing, right? So when governments tax individuals and they separate production and distribution, effectively it's a kind of theft, right? It's an unjust redistribution of an individual's wealth against their own choice. Nozick tries to give this really nice example of how this works. Now, I've already given the example with me. It works out to be basically the same thing, but we'll take a look at this Wilt Chamberlain example. This is what Nozick gives to try to illustrate his point. Now, Wilt Chamberlain, if you are not familiar with him, is an NBA player who scored 100 points in a game in 1962. I think he did it another time. I'm not quite sure on that. You can always go look it up. But anyway, so this Wilt Chamberlain example runs something like this. And so just what matters is that Wilt Chamberlain's a famous basketball player. Let us grant you whatever ideal distribution of property in society you desire. We'll call that D1, right? So assume you're an end-state theorist. You think wealth really should have a pattern, right? Let's say it's that, I don't know, the wealthiest 1% should own 5% of the wealth. When, I don't know, there'd be this whole pattern worked in, presumably. You'd have this, a certain way society should look in terms of who has how much stuff. So Nozick says, let's just grant you your ideal distribution, D1. Everybody has exactly how much they deserve. Now, let's take Wilt Chamberlain. Of course, he's this famous basketball player. Say he signs an agreement with a certain team, so he gets traded to whatever team. He works out a deal where for every ticket sale, there's a little separate bucket of money where everybody has to put in a quarter, or a certain amount, right? A nickel or a dime or something. Everybody has to put a quarter in the bucket to come see Wilt play. And of course, all sorts of people voluntarily want to come see Wilt play, and so they buy their ticket to the game, but they also put their extra bit of money in the little bucket so they can see Wilt because he's so great. Now, over the course of the season, Wilt's going to make a whole bunch of money out of the bucket, right? Now, the fact that Wilt made a whole bunch of extra money out of the bucket is going to upset your pattern, D1. All of a sudden, you've got thousands or even potentially millions of people who have all voluntarily given Wilt a little bit of their money, right? So their position in the pattern is slightly worse. Each of them has a little bit less money than they did. Now, of course, Wilt, getting a little bit at a time, but from a great many people, all of a sudden he shoots way up, right? Wilt has way more money than he used to, and all these other people a little bit less. Now, how did this happen? Through the free choice of individuals. All sorts of people each said, yeah, I want to see Wilt play, and I'm willing to pay an extra quarter or whatever it is to see that. So they are all willing to make themselves slightly worse off, get rid of a bit of their stuff to see Wilt play. Now, Wilt voluntarily plays in exchange for money, right? Now, it's not his fault. All sorts of people want to see him play. So he makes all kinds of money from this, right? His position changes drastically. So all of a sudden, your favorite pattern, D1, which had everybody in their right position, everybody had the right amount of stuff to make sure that the distribution of goods was just, D1 is now upset, right? It's been altered. Now all of a sudden, Wilt has way too much stuff. All these other people don't have enough stuff. So what do? Well, if you're a pattern theorist, you want to reset the pattern, right? We can't let Wilt be way up here and all these people are a little bit down. We've got to get it back into equilibrium, right? We've got to lift all these other people up a bit and get Wilt back down where he should be. What's that going to look like? Well, either Wilt voluntarily gives all his money back, which presumably he doesn't want to do, right? He was playing in exchange for money. So if he's not willing to give it all back and just do whatever he was doing for free, and all sorts of people don't want to do stuff for free, right? We've got needs, right? We need to live, buy food, all sorts of stuff. Also, it's nice to have choices. The more property you have, the more choices you have about what you can do. Right? So Wilt's probably not going to give it back. So if we need to reset the pattern, get back to D1, what are we going to do? Well, we can take his money from him, right? Have some kind of system of taxation where you forcefully try to reset the pattern over time. Now, Nozick says you can do this in different sorts of ways. It could be a sales tax, it could be an income tax, right? You can just make the free market illegal. You say people can't buy and sell things at all anymore, right? You just have to stay in the pattern. He says that's not realistic. So assuming people are going to use their freedom of choice to upset the pattern and trade goods and get more stuff and get less stuff over time. Really, the only way you can try to maintain a pattern is by violating the liberty of what should be free citizens, right? And by doing that, you are violating their rights. And really, their rights are captured by those three principles of the entitlement theory. How is it that you come to have a legitimate claim to a certain kind of good? Well, either you make it yours, right? It was initially unowned and you make it yours somehow. There's not an awful lot of that anymore. Most things are owned one way or another. So how do we come to own things? By exchanging, freely exchanging with somebody else, right? They voluntarily give you something in exchange for what you voluntarily give them, right? So it's a mutual exchange. So ultimately, this is Nozick's view, and he thinks the Wilt Chamberlain example helps forcefully illustrate how liberty upsets patterns, right? Why you just can't maintain a pattern of the distribution of goods in society in a way that doesn't violate the liberty of free citizens. Now, a final point here. Oh, I got ahead of myself a little bit. My apologies. So, like I was saying, Nozick's point with the Wilt Chamberlain example is just that maintaining a pattern restricts liberty. And so you've got to do something that really, you have to violate people's liberty somehow in order to try to maintain the pattern. Because over time, if you just let history play out, and we let people make the decisions they make for whatever reasons they find convincing, then you're just not going to maintain that pattern. And Nozick thinks it's unjust to force people to maintain some pattern that they themselves don't voluntarily wish to maintain through their actions. There's a kind of top-down thinking in wanting there to be a pattern to the distribution of goods in society. And Nozick thinks that's really a form of tyranny. Okay, one last point. Nozick has been going on and articulating this theory for us. Now, there's something that isn't in the reading, but is in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and I just want to put that out there for the sake of clarity. Now, a lot of people will look to something like Nozick's book, Libertarian Thinking, and say, yeah, that's how we should run society right now. People shouldn't have to give up anything that they have if they don't want to. We shouldn't have taxes and redistributions of goods in society against people's will. People only should give other people what they voluntarily want to give them. Now, of course, there's a question there. Are current holdings just? Remember, Nozick's whole theory is in some sense idealized, just like many other political theories, because they're trying to think of what would the best society look like? What's the best way to organize ourselves? What's justice demand? Right? What would be the most just society? Now, if you think back to the three principles of the entitlement theory, the first one is how unowned things become owned. Right? So there's a question, did all things come to be owned in the right way in the first place? Tough question to answer, probably impossible in some sense to answer. And then principles 2 and 3, people should only exchange property voluntarily, and if an exchange isn't voluntary, right, if there's some kind of theft, then there needs to be some kind of rectification of injustice. Some steps need to be taken to correct the wrong that occurred. Now, Nozick himself says, what we really need is a historical treatment of the distribution of goods in a society to determine whether or not we can apply my theory, the entitlement theory, and actually hold that no scheme of redistribution would be just. Right? Because if you actually look at history, what's it full of? Injustice, right? People taking things that aren't ours, war, theft, right? Murder, all sorts of terrible things. And it's just not the case that all of those terrible things have been settled, right? It's just not the case they've been made up for. And we can think of all sorts of examples of that. So we need this historical treatment applied to particular societies to determine whether or not their distribution of holdings is just or not. And short answer, Nozick thinks, is that basically all societies, the answer is going to be no, the holdings aren't just, right? The distribution has not been done correctly. And it's only once we've figured out how to get that distribution correct that Nozick thinks we can actually apply his theory. So he gives this clarification in the book. He says, in the absence of such a historical treatment applied to a particular society, one cannot use the analysis and theory presented here to condemn any particular scheme of transfer payments, unless it is clear that no considerations of rectification of injustice could apply to it. Although to introduce socialism as the punishment for our sins would be to go too far, past injustices might be so great as to make necessary in the short run a more extensive state in order to rectify it. So ultimately, just with those closing lines there, Nozick thinks there should be the sort of minimal state. We should have the smallest state possible, and really it's just there to protect people, right? Defend their rights, defend their property rights, and make sure they're free from harm. Now, what he's saying here is that because there are historical injustices that need to be rectified before holdings are just and the theory can be applied, we might, at least in the short term, be able to justify the existence of a state that's larger than just the bare minimum, that includes some kind of taxation system and scheme of transfer payments to try to make up for historical injustices, say things like slavery, genocide, warfare, theft, right, land dispossession, and so on. So of course, if we just take the Canadian context, there are interesting questions there. What, if any, historical injustices have been visited upon Aboriginal peoples in terms of their lands and what's been given up and so on, what has been ceded, what hasn't been ceded, right? Now, I'm not trying to take up any particular view here, but oh yes, well, this is owed by these people to those people, but this was given up rightfully and so on. But rather, the issue is that there's an open question there. And this is exactly what Nozick is getting at. So say within the Canadian context, if there's some kind of scheme of transfer payments, right, and say Aboriginal people are beneficiaries of those scheme of payments, what Nozick is saying here is that you can't say, oh, well, that kind of payment system is unjust because you take Nozick's theory and apply it. Right? You say, oh, that's a scheme of taxation and it's taking money from some people and giving it to others against their will. Nozick says, right, you can only say that that is unjust if you really, right, if it's clear that no considerations of rectification of injustice could apply to it, right, could apply to it. So if it seems like those sorts of considerations could apply, then what we need is an actual historical treatment. We need to, in some sense, get our hands dirty. What was traded when? Was it done fairly? Were any deals underhanded? Was there force involved? What exactly has been gained and lost? These are all important and interesting questions that apply to the actual situations that we're presented with in the world. Given that Nozick is so interested in history and how people come to have different sorts of rights and entitlements over property based on the decisions they make, he thinks that it's really up to us, all of us, to actually look into the details to determine whether or not people, sort of in general, both as individuals and groups, really deserve what they own through their past actions. Right? And if, in fact, there has been injustice, there has been a theft or some sort of unjust transfer of property, then it needs to be rectified before the theory can be applied in practice. All right, that's it for Nozick. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. We're going to pick up in the next video taking a look at John Rawls, who's going to offer an alternative view, trying to justify ultimately a patterned approach to the distribution of wealth and arguing in favor of having an ongoing coercive system of wealth redistribution within a democratic society in which we should conceive of subjects as free and having freedoms to make choices with what they want to do with their actions, their time, and their goods. So thank you very much for watching. I hope what's going on in Nozick has become clear, and I'll see you next time.